The last session of the day, I'm equally excited for. A lot of people say, if only I knew that when it went wrong, if only I didn't make that mistake to begin with. So we're very fortunate to have Justin Smithline here to talk about the 10 reasons startup fails, tales from the actual trenches, and hopefully some actionable takeaway advice. So round of applause for Justin. Justin. What's that? You can take the lanyard. Okay. Every time video would look nice. Okay. Okay.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. So I appreciate y'all being here and not at the bar watching the Brazil game next door, which I'm sure is very tempting. So my name is Justin Smithline. I'm an investor at ERA, but I'm also a recovering founder. So like many of you, I've spent many years in the trenches starting companies. So when they asked me to come and speak, I was trying to understand a little bit better who the audience was, because initially they wanted me to talk about investing. And when I found out it was founders, I said, you know what, they hear a lot about raising capital, things like that. I will have a little blurb on that at the end. But I thought it might be more helpful to talk about some of the things that I've learned, both as a founder myself, but then also as an investor, having seen now lots and lots of companies, kind of go through that struggle and eventually succeed or fail. And so that was led to the my talk here today. Okay, so a little bit about me. I've spent about 20 years in the startup world. Out of college, I went to work in Boston at Fidelity Investments. Realized I didn't like being in a very large company at that time, so kind of caught the startup bug during the first .com boom and went to work at a company in Boston that turned out to be very successful, and then sort of whet my appetite for the startup world. And I haven't really looked back since. So I've started 3 of my own companies. One we sold, one is still going, one failed. Through ERA, I'll talk about ERA in a moment, we have invested in 165 companies. I'm also an angel investor in about a dozen companies. Fun fact about me, I grew up on a farm in upstate New York in the middle of nowhere, and I had a pet goat named Petunia. So that's Petunia. I had to somehow fit Petunia into this presentation, so there you go. So a little bit about ERA, for those of you that may not be familiar with it. It stands for Entrepreneurs Roundtable Accelerator. We were the first accelerator in New York. We've been around 7 years now. In that 7 years, we've invested in 165 companies. We split fairly evenly across B2B and B2C. Our companies now have gone on and raised hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital, and the portfolio's down in the billions of dollars now. So still early for us, but so far so good. We run a very intensive, hands-on 4-month program where companies move into our space, and then we help them over this 4-month period. We bring a tremendous amount of human capital to bear on our companies to help make sure they reach that next inflection point that's going to help them succeed. And a lot of it is some of the things that I'm about to talk about. In terms of our process, we see over 2,000 companies a year, and we invest in about 25. So without further ado, top 10 reasons companies fail. This is an old Paul Graham quote, but it's really truer now than it's ever been, and it's very obvious, but I feel like it's very important to make that point, because sometimes when you have that inspiration of an idea and you start a business, you're so obsessed with the idea and you think it's such a good idea that you don't actually bother checking with too many people to make sure it is in fact a real pain point. So in terms of examples of things that people want: money, companionship, safety. But I wanted to make this point too, because people get so focused on raising capital or whatever, and but without this, you're never going to be successful. So regardless of how much money you raise. And then when you look around you here, you see Wells Fargo, you see Amazon, you see Crate and Barrel. These are all companies that at one time were startups and found tremendous product market fit and allowed them to be very, very big companies. So my second point is is really meant to sort of reiterate the first point, but then also get you to think through how badly do people want my thing? Because what we see a lot of is what I call the curse of moderate success, right? There's some signal from customers that they kind of like your thing, they're not hanging up on you, they're returning every 10th phone call. So as founders, we think, oh my gosh, this person really wants my widget or whatever, but they're just, you have to figure out are they just really just being nice to you, and how big is that pain point? Show of hands here, how many founders do we have in the room? Okay, great. How many repeat founders? How many people that have founded more than one company? Okay, wow, all right, your spouses must really hate you. Great, and how many people have raised any kind of capital in the past for their businesses? Great, well, lots of smart people in this room, and I just wanted to also make the point, I'm gonna run through this. I'm happy to take questions at any time. I'm gonna have a couple pauses in between for questions, but if things pop in your head, you wanna ask me a question, feel free to do that as well. My last point here, I think it's important for people to think about is, how do you know when you really have good product market fit? And it's one of those things you sort of know it when you see it, because people are just ripping it out of your hands, right? Maybe the product's not done. Maybe it barely works. Maybe it's super buggy. Maybe you haven't even built it yet, as you just built a landing page, but there's tremendous demand for it. So that's really what you're looking for. So as founders, you spend the next several years of your life doing this, and you just want to make sure you're positioning yourself for success. So here's a question, and I don't know the answer. How many lines of business is Amazon in today? Anyone know? I don't know either. 100, 200, dozens? Right, but how many were they in when they started? And this I know, one, right? So they sold books on the internet. And so oftentimes we run into founders at ERA and they say, well, we're doing, we have this product and this product and this product and this platform and this type of customer, right? And what we try to encourage them is, well, who's your one customer, right? Because if you think about Amazon, when they started that business, if they tried to start with 24 lines of businesses like they have today or whatever it is, they would have not made it, right? They would have completely failed. So thinking about focusing your business in a singular manner is crucially important. And so the other thing you want to sort of ask yourself is, who's your one perfect customer? So show of hands, who wants to shout out who their customer is, who, as specifically as possible, who your customer is. Anyone? Okay.
Americans paying out-of-pocket expenses to doctors.
Americans paid out, okay, not bad. Any geography? Any type of income?
Beachhead market is maternity, pre-pregnancy, and pediatric.
Gotcha. So that's actually pretty good. Normally, a lot of times what we'll see is, oh yeah, we're selling to businesses. Right, well, okay, well that's not very helpful. And this is not something you should do for investors. You really need to do it for yourself. So if I said to you, oh, we sell to companies or we sell to professional services firms, is that more or less helpful than saying, well, we sell to professional services, specifically lawyers at law firms between 500 and 1,000 attorneys in New York focused on aerospace litigation, right? I don't know. Right, but when you're that focused, everything gets easier. Your marketing messaging gets easier. You hire a salesperson, you can't tell them just go sell to companies, right? They're gonna fail and they won't succeed. But if you give them that level of focus, the probability that they're gonna be able to succeed in their role is much higher. And also for you, for those of you that are earlier, as you're trying to figure your businesses out, it's much easier to cross things off the list, right? So if you tried that strategy I just mentioned and it fails, well, what do? You go to, maybe not aerospace litigation, you go to automobile or what have you. But it's much easier for you to learn very rapidly, which is something I'll talk about here in a moment. Picking a bad market. So this is, starting a startup is so overwhelmingly difficult and the odds are so stacked against you. When you pick a bad market, you're making it 10 times worse for yourself. Not twice as hard, 10 times hard. And so what I have to think about when I think about markets is, are there tailwinds or headwinds? Because if you've got a market with headwinds, you could execute flawlessly. When I say headwinds, I mean a market that's contracting, that's in major, major flux, what have you. Maybe there's certain regulatory constraints around the market. When you have markets with headwinds, you could execute flawlessly and still wind up with a single, right? Whereas if you have tailwinds in your market, you could screw up 100 times and still be wildly successful. So that's something that we think a lot about as investors is this a good market? Are there tailwinds in this market? Are there headwinds in this market? And so I had to give some examples of what I believe to be bad markets, and I'm not always right. Music, local reviews, social travel. We as investors, whenever we see these categories, the bar is just tremendously high for us to even bother taking a look at it. Good markets, CRM, insurance, cybersecurity, right? And so one of the things that I think you should ask yourself is, is there headwinds or tailwinds in my market? And another way that you can sort of figure that out is, what's the competitive set in my market? Because sometimes we'll meet, the founders will say, oh, we don't have any competitors. And for us, it's a big red flag because that means there's no money being spent for your whatever it is that you're offering, And so, the question you want to ask yourself is there a budget line item for my thing? Are people Googling for my thing, right? And if the answer is no, or it's a struggle, then think about doing something else or adjusting what you're doing in a way that really, positions yourself better for success. The one sort of exception here is brand new market. So there's a market that's growing really quickly. That can still be a good market. I remember meeting this founder about a decade ago, Eric, and he was in the analytics space for mobile advertising. And at that time, that, believe it or not, it was a very, very small market. It was, I think, $400 million. But he showed me the slide of the last 3 years in that market, and the growth curve was straight up. So when you're in those sort of new emerging markets that are growing really fast, that's okay. We recently invested in a company in the voice space. So if you think about Amazon Alexa or Google Home, there's a proliferation of these devices, Siri, right? So there's more and more applications and ways people can interface with these devices. And so designing experiences for users or customers is not, it's not as simple as just saying what you want it to say, right? So we backed a company that is design software for voice applications. They got acquired by Adobe, within 1 year. It was pretty crazy. But you do see that with good markets, and that's an area where we just got lucky with a great founder and a really good market timing. Other good markets, cybersecurity, insurance, right? There are hundreds, or actually thousands of competitors in these spaces, but that's not a bad thing because they're all in business. So how many of you have co-founders? Okay, so don't say anything bad about them in front of them. But when you have co-founders, it's very difficult. So that sort of team, from an investor perspective, that team chemistry and team risk is a big reason why companies fail, because the teams just don't get along. Because startups are, there's these pressure cookers. You've sort of told all your friends and family you're leaving your well-paying jobs, you're doing this thing, everybody thinks you're crazy, and so you want to succeed. And so that founder dynamic is something that is important. So one of the things that we look for is, how long have founders worked together? Oftentimes these founder relationships last longer than most marriages, right? So also, is there who does the buck stop with? So if you have two equal co-founders and you're really at an impasse, someone has to be able to make the decision, right? So that's one of the things that I think is important for you in your teams. If you don't have that, hopefully everything goes great, but when there are times there are very difficult decisions and you have to just make one, you disagree, who makes that call, right? So it's something that I think you as founders should think about. And also, what are your personal runways? You need to be completely transparent with your co-founders. If you were, selling your soul to Wall Street for a decade, and you've now set aside hundreds of thousands of dollars, you got 2 years of runway to just burn and make your startup successful, and your co-founder has got, 3 mortgages and, $5,000 in the bank and is out of money in 6 weeks, that's a real problem. So you have to be aligned on all of these things, and that misalignment, if you're not openly talking about it, can cause a lot of issues down the road. And so the final point with this slide is really that last one, which is to have founder vesting. Does everybody know what vesting is? Everyone? You really need this. So, if one founder leaves for whatever reason, good or bad, you need to be able to protect the company. So you can't let somebody walk out the door after 6 months with 50% of the equity. That's basically going to kill the company. It's going to be very hard to raise capital. It's going to be very difficult to recruit in new people to kind of pick up the baton and keep forging forward. As founders, I feel like sometimes because we're trying to be very innovative with our widget, whatever it may be, we feel like we need to be innovative with everything else, business model, et cetera. So I'll often have founders that come to me and say, well, good news, I got this customer and they want to buy my widget, but they want to buy it, they want to pay up front for it for 2 years because that's their budget cycles. And we told our investors that we're a SaaS company and we want revenue coming in monthly. So what should we do? And I say, take the money. So don't try to. You have to think about friction to adoption. And with anything that you're doing, it's always hard to get new customers to adopt anything. The last thing you want to do is also make it hard for them to buy it, utilize it, share it, right? So just be thoughtful around, try to always ask yourself, what is the simplest way I can solve this problem? Whether it's on the product side, maybe there's lots of software you can build to try to notify a user about something, and then they log into your notification dashboard and blah, 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 or you just send them an email, right? What's easier, right? And so just when in doubt, always ask yourself, what's the simplest way to solve this? So this is self-explanatory. A lot of times as founders, we have rose-colored glasses on, right? We've gone all in on this thing. We've told everyone it's going to work, and so we want it to work. And so when that happens, you sort of put the rose-colored glasses on and start to believe, or not maybe hear what the market's actually telling you. Maybe they're telling you they're not that excited about what you're doing. Maybe they're not telling you that you're not actually solving a problem. And so we just have to listen. Listening to talking ratio. This also goes for pitching customers. A lot of times we'll see founders, I'll sit in on some customer pitches and they just talk at the customer 95% of the time, right? It should be the reverse. You should just be asking a lot of questions, get the customer talking, try to understand, is this going to be a fit for them or not? And it shouldn't, if it's not a fit, you don't want to force it to be a fit. Say, what, maybe this isn't a fit, let's move on, or what would make it a fit? What would, turn it into sort of Socratic method discovery? What would you do? The most successful organizations that we see do this. They learn, adapt, and they change. Our assumption as investors is, in almost every single case, the initial thesis that you have is wrong in some way, either on the product, the customer, the industry, whatever. And so what we're oftentimes betting on as early stage investors is your ability to figure it out, right? And so what we like to see are teams that learn and iterate and adapt. And the tighter you're able to create this feedback loop, the more swings at the bat that you get. Because if you think about what a startup is, this is a sort of famous Steve Blank quote, it's just a temporary organization used to search for repeatable and scalable business model, right? And as founders, assuming we have to pay rent somewhere, we don't have an unlimited amount of time to figure this out. So you have a limited amount of time based on your personal runway or the runway that investors have given you. So the question is, how many swings at the bat are you going to take before you figure this out? And so if you are good at creating what we call rapid learning organization, the more swings of that bat you're going to get, and the higher the probability, eventually you'll find something that hits and gives you the probability to succeed and eventually become a big business. I think about one company that I was an investor in. It is an organic baby food company. For those of you that had kids, you've probably heard of it. It's called Happy Baby. And when I've been involved in that company since very early on. When they started that company, the original vision was, hey, we make organic baby food. It's fresh, frozen baby food, which if you've been to Europe, that's a very common way people buy and serve baby food there. So their insight was, hey, worked in Europe, doesn't exist here. We're going to do it here, and we're going to make it organic. And so they tried to do that, and they launched in a bunch of stores, and it turns out no one really wanted it. They sold some of it, but not as much as you would sort of hope. And so, like good founders, they said, I wonder what else, their mission really was to serve nutritious food to kids, so what else could we make more nutritious that kids are consuming? And so there's those little puff pails, which are like little Cheerios, and it turns out, there's a lot of gunk in them. And so they said, there's no organic form of those, let's make those. And so pretty rapidly, they decided, they made that decision, they went after it, and it sold really, really well. And that really kicked the company off, and then kind of the growth curve went sort of like this to like this. And then at that time too, there was some new shelf-stable packaging, these little pouches that you see everywhere. 10 years ago, they were pretty novel. And they said, well, instead of having jars, you need a spoon. These things are much easier to feed to kids. And so they were one of the first companies to put baby foods in those, those little packages. And then sales just exploded, and it was tremendously successful. But they were very good at learning from the market, iterating and adapting, and importantly, not stopping until they found something that's actually really meaningful, that's worth giving up your life to pursue, So this one you see a lot of with companies that go out, they're great storytellers, they're great fundraisers, they get a bunch of money, but they haven't really proven anything yet. And so the instinct is often, I got all this money now, I have to hire sales guys, I have to hire a marketer, I have to hire a product team, I have to hire more engineers, and they just start, kind of running around the Tasmanian devil, spinning up a lot of activity when, if you go back to the number one slide, maybe they haven't solved for that yet, and so this is very dangerous. It happens a lot, and the next thing you know, 15 months later, going back to your investors, you're kind of saying, oops, I need more money, and you're not anywhere near your projections that you thought you would be. So here, you should not prematurely try to scale until you've got product market fit, and you've got some sense of your CAC to LTV, which is customer acquisition cost to lifetime value of the business. So you have some sense of, can you profitably acquire companies? So the flip side of this is scale too late. So occasionally, in rare cases, when you really nail product market fit and people are just ripping it out of your hands and you can't keep enough of it in stock or keep up with the activity, that is actually the time to step on the gas, because these days it's really easy to rip people off and copy stuff. And so if people see a business is working and there's dollars being accrued somewhere, you're going to have, in 12, 24 months, you'll have a dozen plus competitors, some of them very well funded, some of them very large companies. So in those cases, it makes sense probably to step on the gas, go out, get some venture capital, maybe get some debt financing, and really try to grow the business. Because as we all know, most of the value in these businesses, a lot of times they'll accrue to the top few players. So before I get to my bonus content, top 5 mistakes companies make when raising capital, I want to see if there's questions. Or would you prefer the questions be at the end? At the end? Okay. So you get to hear me yammer on a little bit longer. So you guys will appreciate this without comment. Okay, so number one mistake I see is not qualifying your investors. So this is really important. As founders, all we have is time, right? And so you have to be super efficient with your time if you want to be successful. So you want to make sure that whoever you're pitching there's actually some probability that they're going to invest, right? So if you are a early stage pre-seed company, you should not be running around pitching a Series B or Series C or D or later firm. A lot of times these bigger firms, they have an army of analysts that they'll probably send all you guys emails and saying, oh, this big fund wants to talk to me, oh my gosh, right? But the probability that these folks are going to invest is basically zero. So you just need to be careful about that. A lot of times those people that are reaching out to you, one of the things they're metriced on is how many calls or meetings are you getting with startups. And they're trying to catch you before you get really big. But you should just think about, is the stage of this investor match the stage of my company? The second is sector, right? So if you're in healthcare or you're a B2B company, for example, don't pitch a B2C investor. They're never going to invest. So you just think about, is this a mismatch? A lot of times as founders, we get so excited because any investor wants to talk to us that we just sort of run to the meeting. But you have to kind of resist that and almost have a reverse mindset and say, you know what, I only want to take meetings if I think this actually might go somewhere. Recency. So there's a lot of people running around claiming to be angel investors or funds, but maybe they're between funds, maybe they're not really angel investors. So you want to kind of get a sense of when's the last time they wrote a check. Was it 3 months ago or was it 3 years ago? If it's 3 years ago, they're probably not going to invest in your company. Same thing with check size. If you're trying to raise $10 million, you can't run around trying to raise 25 grand from angel investors. It'll take too long. You'll never get there. It'll be just a huge slog and waste of your time. So, whereas if you just need 400 grand to get out of the gates, that's totally fine. So you need to think about that match and say, are these investors qualified or not? There's a great resource to do this. You can go on Crunchbase. I'm sure you've all heard of Crunchbase. You can type in just about any investor and see all of the recent deals. And so if you go in there and you see, oh, Fund X just, they've done all Series B and C, and there's only one C deal, and it was 3 years ago, they're probably not going to do your round, and you don't have to waste time talking to them. You always be polite, say, hey, look, I appreciate you reaching out. I would love to come back to you in 12 months or a little farther along. I think we're too early. The second mistake that I often see is not making it your number one priority. The probability of success in raising money is directly correlated to how much effort you put into the process. And if, as founders, we can get torn in a million different directions. Remember I talked about focus earlier? The most successful fundraisers are people that just focus just on raising capital. And sometimes, it can take a lot longer than you think. Sometimes you think, oh, I'll be done in a month. It could take 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. But if you do it right, that's the only way to do it. And it's better, and if you do that and no one's biting, then you know what? Maybe you need to take a step back and readjust and figure out why, or grow your business a little bit more, or focus on your customers a little bit longer. But you've got to make it your number one priority, or you're never gonna get there. So I could give a whole lecture just on this, but essentially, you want to be able to put together a compelling investor story. And a lot of times, I'll meet a founder, and I'll see their deck, I'll read through it, and I start talking to them, and then they'll say, oh yeah, well, I'm like, well, how'd you come up with the idea? And they said, well, I spent 20 years in industry solving this, experiencing this specific pain point every day, and I have all these unique insights and et cetera on how I'm going to solve it, and and I have all these great relationships I'm going to bring to bear to really help me be the player here and create a successful business. And that doesn't come out at all in the deck, right? So whatever, don't bury the lead. Whatever your highlights are, whether it's your traction for the business, your backgrounds as founders, maybe you've already raised some other money, you've got third-party validation from customers or from investors. You've got to put your best foot forward because you have to understand investors see so much stuff. You've got to the only way to cut through the noise is to get their attention. And and that's how you get their attention. So anyone have over $1 million in revenue? Anyone have $100,000 in revenue? Okay. So if you went to an investor and said, hey, I have $100,000 in revenue, some investors might be like, oh, that's great. A lot of investors are going to be like, so? But if, because that's a picture of what you're doing in revenue. If I said to you, I did $100,000 in revenue, and 3 months ago we were at $5,000 in revenue, I'm like, oh, what is the slope of that curve? It's pretty steep, right? You grew 20x in 3 months. That's exciting, right? And that's what investors want to see, and that's the story you should be telling if that indeed is the experience that you have. Does that make sense? And that kind of goes back to momentum. Investors want to, they want to be basically the last check-in, at the latest point possible if they could, And so you need to sort of paint a momentum-driven story for your business and try to, try to collapse the process. I'll talk more about the process in a minute. Part of this too is how are you uniquely suited to win? So like I said earlier, if you've got some special relationships or insight, you've got to tell that as part of your story as well. So this is sort of obvious, but I have to say it because I see it all the time. And another reason mistakes people make when they're raising money is they just pitch too few people. So founders come to me and they say, Justin, I'm really struggling to raise money. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. Can you help me? I say, okay, well, come in, let's sit down. I'll kind of run through your list with you and see where you're at, see if I can help. And invariably they sit down and they show me their list and there's 10 people on it, or 12, or 15, right? And so you need a list of at least 100 people. If you're serious about going to raise money, you have to assume you're going to hear no from 98% of them, if you're lucky. So it truly is a numbers game. I love this with Jeff Bezos. I don't think most people know this. He had to pitch 60 people to get his first $1 million. Think about how many people he reached out to get those 60 meetings, probably 200 or more, right? So imagine, and he raised like $25,000 increments, and imagine if he'd never done that or he gave up after the 40th person said no. There'd be no Amazon and we'd all be, shopping in stores, God forbid. So that would just be terrible. So, so the last point here is really, and I spoke to this about making your number one priority, but there is a process here. A lot of times, as founders, we're so busy trying to build our thing, and we're trying to recruit people, you're trying to manage your engineers, and you're trying to talk to customers, and then once in a while I have an investor meeting, like, oh yeah, I've got an investor meeting in 2 weeks, I'm gonna see how it goes, and then depending on how it goes, if it doesn't go well, maybe I'll get another investor meeting lined up. That is the exact opposite of how you need to run a fundraising process. I see it all the time. You really have to be very, very careful about doing that, because if that is your process, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed. And if you are successful, it's going to take you 10 times longer to actually get the round done. So it's a parallelized process, not serialized. So if you decide, hey, I'm going to go out and raise money, you get your list of 100 plus people, and then starting on day one, you're having 3, 4, 5, 6 meetings a day, calls, meetings, right? You're trying to collapse time and run a real process. You want to keep following. Investors are really busy because there's always some deal that's closing that week or the next week. So even if they like what you're doing, they might just be too bogged down to really think about it. So you have to be persistent. You have to follow up. You have to sort of stay on top of them. And the way I like to think about it, because you get rejected constantly, so and it can be depressing. So I try to flip the script and expect the no, embrace the no, and celebrate a no, and then once in a while you'll get a yes. So I find that mentally that can help overcome the challenges that just hearing no all the time can present to you. If you are fortunate enough to run a good process and you actually get a term sheet from an investor, that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, get a second term sheet. Do people know why? Because you have no leverage when you get this first term sheet, right? You might say, well, I want to raise $6 million at a $10 million valuation, and I don't want any extra rights. I don't want to give up any board seats. And the investor will say, well, I like what you're doing. Here's a term sheet, but I don't like your valuation, so I'm going to offer you half the valuation. I'm going to offer you less money. I want 3 board seats so I control your company, right? And the only way that you have to really mitigate that is to have options, So that's really the point of running this parallel process is if somebody comes in and gives you a term sheet and you're not talking to anyone else, you might not have any other options, right? And so that's the point of being in a lot of these conversations at the same time. So with that, I have a slide here on additional resources, just a couple. I'm sure you're all familiar with this book. If you're not, it's really good, so you have to go read it. This is Steve Blank's 4 Steps of the Epiphany. One of the other best books I've ever read, written by a founder who's now a sort of famous investor at Andreessen Horowitz. Ben Horowitz wrote a book called The Hard Thing about hard things. And the bottom, this is a great resource. Not a lot of people know about this. Google Ventures put together something called a design sprint. And it really, it's a lot of customer-driven exercises to really help you understand, things like product market fit, things like does anyone want my widget, things like where's my best go-to-market. So I would Google that and kind of dig into that. So with that, I will stop and pause for questions. I know I'm the last thing standing between you all and the refreshments. It's not a responsibility I take lightly. So raise your hand. Yes?
Why do so many smart people say no? It sounds like Harry Potter objection to that.
Yeah.
People are smart. Why can't they see what's really obvious?
So the question is, why do smart people say no when they see good opportunities? Is that?
Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
these always like Harry
Yeah. We have to understand when you see a lot of stuff, it's very hard to know early on, because everyone's telling you their thing's going to be the next great thing. And that's what, as founders, that's what I'm trying to instill in you is it's so competitive to raise money that you have to really spend the time on thinking through what your investor story is, why it's compelling, and why it's interesting, so that when you do get these opportunities, you get to put your best foot forward. Because sometimes people are brilliantly smart, they're great operators, they're really bad at talking to people. That's just not their strength, And so good investors will dig in and say, well, maybe I'm missing something. Let me see what's here. But not a lot of them do, because to them, they're just waiting for the next kind of obviously great deal, which, by the way, a lot of these obvious great deals turn out to be terrible deals. But it's really just a numbers game. A lot of times it's just, maybe they just got burned on a deal in a very similar space. They don't know about it. Or maybe they're the partner at the firm that really, pushed through some other deal that turned out to be a terrible investment. So they don't have really that much pull at the firm relative to the person that snuck them into Uber, right? And they made $1 gazillion on it, and that person can walk at anything. Right? So there's all these intra-firm dynamics that you're not really familiar with. So there's a lot of reasons why, and also just timing. If you're an angel investor, you just wrote a bunch of checks and none of them have exited yet, maybe you're waiting, to get more liquidity to reinvest. So there's a lot of reasons. Yes.
Hi, Val Selin here, founder, director, CTO, Funeral. Have a question for you. So I've unofficially met my co-founder, which is a strange story. She's actually, runs an organic food company of all things. So here's the thing. I never quite understood the relationship between founder and co-founder. Are we going to be splitting decision-making? Should I take the lead and sort of let her follow or vice versa? She has a whole heck of a lot more experience than I do running an organic food company for many years. And so I feel like that should be a natural progression. So any thoughts, ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Thanks.
So, and you see it a lot where, we're going to be a great team, and you spend several meetings, sometimes several months together, you get in office, and you sort of put off having that equity discussion. Happens all the time, and just because you're sort of almost afraid to broach it. And then when it comes up, one founder's like, I just assumed we'd be 50-50. And this person's like, well, it was my idea, and so I thought I would get 95% of it, and then it's like, what? So that happens a lot. And so you just have to talk about it, and think about, who's really driving it, whose original idea. If it's something you truly did come together on it, and you bring, if it's your idea, then you have the argument to say, hey, look, I'm doing this, I laid the groundwork, but I really feel like I'd love to have you come on as a co-founder. There's no real hard and fast rules around it. You also don't, if you have if there's two of you, there's no hard and fast rule that says you have to be 50-50. There's nothing wrong with it. If you're 80-20 for whatever reason, or you've been at it for 2 years and then finally it's starting to go somewhere and someone just shows up, you have a pretty good argument to say, hey, look, I just give them 2 years of my life and no salary, you're still making a paycheck, so that's fine. But it's really a discussion. I think all the co-founders have to feel like it's fair, but don't put off talking about it and don't make assumptions because they're almost always wrong. Sure, yeah.
Hi, I have a comment and then a question. So a couple years ago when we were just an idea, I actually ran into Murat, who is one of the founders at
great.
Era. Yeah, so, when I found out that you have an accelerator, naturally, we applied. We got turned down, which we should have. We were really just an idea, at the time. But since then, in the last year, spent a lot of time on the road interviewing hundreds of people. And so now we've built up a very good social media following, and people are coming to us saying, when is it going to be ready? We want to start using this now, which is great. We are a gift registry for birthdays and holidays. So now we really have all this kind of pressure to get the app out, and we're doing a crowdfunder. And I am wondering, when you look at companies that you're going to invest in, when you look at companies that have done crowdfunding, what do you look at in terms of the metrics around that to help maybe determine if that's a viable company for you?
It's a great question, and the rise of these platforms I think are great because it sort of democratizes the process for everyone, which is always a good thing. The way we often look at these platforms is sort of another market signal of, does anyone care? Does anyone want this, right? It's sort of going back to number 1 in the original slide. And so if you put this out and you're selling it for $10 and you sell 10,000 of them, that gives investors or any stakeholders more confidence that you're onto something this could actually work. Because a lot of times we don't, if you're pre-launch, there's really nothing to go on except sort of you're thinking around how well this person can execute or whatever. So I think most investors look at it really as another signal. But I think for you too, more importantly, it should be a signal for you, because if no one is buying it, then maybe that's saying something as well. How can you change it up or what have you? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Sergey Templar. I'm good relationship with Murat, and I've met quite a few great VCs at the area Roundtable.
Oh,
anyway,
good. I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing. Can you mind speaking into the?
Yeah. Anyway, the question is, what's more in-depth definition of LVR and the ways to improve it?
I'm sorry, I did not catch the
What's
question.
the more in-depth definition of LVR and ways to improve it?
Can anyone help me out?
LVR.
LVR? Oh, LTV?
LTV.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's so many. By the way, when you start getting into this stuff, there's just a lot of don't be intimidated. It's just jargon, and you just have to learn it. But LTV just stands for lifetime value of the customer, which you're trying to. Which as an early stage company, you're obviously not going to know because you're too early to know. But you start to try to guesstimate. Is this if I spend as investors, what we're trying to figure out is, okay, if it costs you $100 to get this customer on however it costs you that, through Facebook or having a salesperson, right? And you're only going to make $100 ever off that customer, the lifetime value is $100, that's a bad return on investment, right? Versus, hey, you know what? We recently backed an insurance company, and they're a new company, but in their category of insurance, the average customer sticks around for 9 years. So we knew even if it cost them, a year or more upfront of cost to get this customer in terms of annual revenue, that they'd probably stick around for 9 years. And so it's just a calculation that as investors we look at And whenever I talk about investors, I try to turn around and say, more importantly, you as founders should think about it. Because sometimes the math is never going to work for your business. So the business model has to map to the opportunity. So if you're selling something that requires a high touch sale, you need a room of people making calls, you're sending salespeople on airplanes, the cost of whatever that is that you're charging for it has got to be pretty high to support sending people around. Otherwise, you're just going to burn all your money and you're going to go out of business, right? So the opposite of that is maybe you have a self-serve turn. Think about Slack or some of these kind of bottoms-up self-serve products, very little low or no touch. And so your business model has to inform the economics you're trying to achieve from your business. So when you're early trying to figure out, number one or number two, one of the things you want to also figure out is what's the market willing to pay for this? Because if unit economics, if it has to be a high touch sale, but they're never going to pay more than $50 a month for it or whatever, then maybe it doesn't work. And you want to do something else, you want to change it somehow. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned that 25 out of 2,000 get accepted into your accelerator. So at what stage of your business or idea should you be looking into doing an accelerator if that's something that you're interested in? And what qualities of the 25 that get accepted, what qualities made you guys want to accept them?
It's a good question. So a lot of it maps to some of the things that we talked about here. Was there a compelling investment story? Is it a market with tailwinds or headwinds? Is there clear customer demand for what they're doing? So it really sort of maps to some of those things that I mentioned. It depends. Each company is unique. In some categories, if we're skeptical on the category, and maybe the founder's unproven, the bar is just going to be a little bit higher versus we're fortunate to back a lot of repeat founders. The company I mentioned, the voice design software, he'd already built and sold a company before coming to ERA. So when you have people with proven track records, you're more willing to go early. And he didn't have anything when he applied to ERA. He barely had a prototype. So in those cases, we will go earlier. In terms of I think there's always value in applying to accelerators because the questions that we ask you in that application process force you to think about your business from an investor perspective, but also from a viability perspective. And oftentimes last cohort we invested in a woman. She applied 3 times. The first time she applied, she had, I think, 0 revenue. The second time, she had maybe $400 a month in revenue. And then she showed up again and had over 6 figures of revenue, and so we got to see her over time really executing and doing well. And so, but there's no, you will make none of the shots that you never take, right? So I always encourage people to try to get some shots on goal. Accelerators are a pretty light way to do that, and if you're fortunate enough to be even to come in for an interview, we ask a lot of good questions that sort of will help you think about your business. You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
We applied for this summer cohort.
Yeah.
We got to the final interviews, and actually our team needed some deconstruction, and we flipped from an app focus to a lender focus because of the conversation we had with you as well.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're reapplying for September.
Okay. Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
go away, fix what you have broken, come back afterwards.
I'll only take credit if it works. Otherwise, I'm just kidding. Yeah. That's great. Good for you. That's great. But yeah, what she just said is really important. There's no, don't be in love with your product. Be in love with kind of the market, the solution, right? Because a lot of times people get so obsessed with the product and the product's not going to be right initially. So you're really going to fall in love with your solution, be passionate about the solution, but be very flexible on your way to getting there. Another Jeff Bezos quote that I like is, strong opinions weakly held. Great. Any other questions?
I think we're going to cut it there just for time because the happy hour is kicking off.
Oh my God.
But please,
Okay.
round of applause for Justin.
Okay.
And yeah, upstairs there's food, drinks, and more. So take the opportunity to meet people who are here. And yeah, thank you for coming out.